Hi, it's Jill Sproat here. Welcome to this week's Storytellers feature from Two Peas in a Bucket. At the heart of scrapbooking is a story, the sharing of experience as it is lived and felt. Each week's Storytellers feature focuses on tools and strategies to assist in the telling of our stories. This week's approach? The timeline. Most of us were introduced to timelines through the pages of our history texts, where the events of entire centuries could be documented neatly and concisely along a single line on a single page. Timelines can be personalized, however, and make for unique tools to guide storytelling and to pinpoint the moments that later reveal themselves to be momentous. In this video, I'll show you how timelines can be used to represent change over time. In this layout, I used a timeline to document how my understanding of what makes a happy family has shifted through the years. I began by selecting 5 photos that in some way speak to definitions of family that I once held or that I hold now. The first shows little me, and the very last one shows not so little me. To create the timeline, I used these stamps from October afternoon, each of which represents a decade. The papers for the project were rather simple. I focused on papers from the Love Notes collection from Crate Paper. Because there were so many photos and there was going to be heavy journaling, I just wanted to make sure that I used a simple approach to the paper. And so the paper on the bottom has a neat effect. It's sort of painterly. And then the vellum, I covered that really bright red section. I was actually going to leave it intact, but it just, the red was a little too bold, so I softened it with vellum. After stitching the vellum to the paper, I was ready to begin my timeline. And so this paper from Lily Bee has family members on it. And so I trimmed it because there are 2 types of families that emerge in my layout. First, there's a family of 4, and then there's a family of 3. And so I trimmed 2 different types of strips and then merged them, just adding some glue on the back to create the strip on which I would stamp the dates for my timeline. So October Afternoon has these new decade stamps, and I believe they go back as far as the 80s. Unfortunately, my timeline needed to go back to 1975. And so what I did was I used really carefully just really specific numerals on the date stamp, inking them individually with an ink pen. And so first I just inked the 19 and then stamped it repeatedly. And then I inked a 7 and stamped that repeatedly. And then very carefully, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that was probably the most awkward part of the whole timeline. But I decided from the beginning I really didn't need to be perfectly precise. I actually like the idea of almost misaligned or random looking stamping. Although the numbers are still chronological, they're not necessarily random in that sense. I didn't want them to be perfectly aligned. As I added each decade to the timeline, one of the things that I did to set the decades apart was to use different colors of ink. So you can see there the variation. First there's the red, and then there's black, and then a neon red, more black, and then I finished off in pink for the current decade. After adding the strip to the layout, I turned my attention on the photos. Initially, I was just going to use the photos as is, but then I got the idea to use photo mats, partly because I can't resist adding more pattern paper to layouts, but the other reason was there was so much pink, just a really heavy presence of it on the layout, that I thought some neutral colors could break it up a bit. I took a pretty efficient approach to matting the photos, put some double stick tape behind them, put them straight on the pattern paper, and then just trimmed right around them. So in no time, all 5 of them were matted. I then added the photos to the layout one by one, organizing them chronologically next to the decades that had been stamped on the timeline. The neat thing about this is that the photos create a kind of second timeline, a photographic one. It's something I actually do a lot on layouts. I love to pull together photos from different eras, and then side by side, they tell their own story. When selecting photos for this layout, I really was mindful of the story that they would be telling together. And I also had this idea of where the journaling might go. The journaling was based on something that was in each one of those photos, but also that would correlate with the timeline. So ahead of time, I just jotted down some wild, all over the place ideas about what family has meant to me over the years. And then I identified a few key dates, a few key years, really. Some of them are a little hazy, but I tried to approximate. And each of these dates is sort of pivotal. It has something to do with my perception of what family was. So I circled each one of those dates using a black Uniball pen, grabbed a ruler, and just created lines extending outward. There was no rhyme or reason here, it's just variations in lines. But I knew that the journaling, just based on what I had done in a preliminary form, I knew that it would be pretty lengthy. And so that's why I needed to make sure that in designing the layout, I left lots of space for the journaling. And then I did something that I don't always do, but I try to do as much as I can on layouts, which is write by hand. Usually, when journaling is really intensely personal for me, it feels wrong to just type it. And so I do grab a pen, and that's what you see here. The interesting thing about the journaling here is that it isn't really the kinds of things you would see conventionally on a timeline, like the War of 1812. But this documents, I guess, a different uh, kind of history. It's a personal history. And so the way that we perceive what events were really formative for us, sometimes we really only understand it in hindsight. And this is very much a hindsight kind of layout. So the journaling begins with me focused on that little blonde chica in the photo. And so it reads, "A child is welcomed into a family according to plan, father, mother, brother, sister." And that's just how I was born. It was all according to plan. You have two kids, and this is how life works. And it says she grows up in a house where everyone has a place, where their roles are clear. It was a very traditional household. The son hangs out with dad, and the daughter hangs out with mom. And then right around the mid 80s, so you have actually three dates circled there, it says, "A little girl plays house. At the center of her family, the father. At the ready, the wife. And in her arms, a crying baby, easily calmed." And that was the thing about playing house, right? Even when, tension crept up, right? Uh, Baby's crying, what do we do? It was all easily calmed. And that was actually sort of how my family worked too. Everything was just maybe a little too good to be true. Um, and then in 1992, it changes. So you can see next to 1992, there's a photo of my parents together. It was actually a photo I had taken a few years prior to that, but I often, as a kid, used to make them, snuggle, hug, kiss her, and then take pictures. But really, apart from that, you wouldn't really see that behavior from them too often. There was just sort of this expectation, of how parents behave, and I was playing house. And so it reads, right around 92, "But a father, a real father, who may never have been real at times when it mattered, leaves one day, never looking back." And that's what happened, just like that. And it was actually sort of astonishing how easy it appeared to be for him just to sort of walk away from it all. So in between that, I added my title because after that point was a huge turning point in my life. My daughter was born. And though trust does not come easily, again, it comes, the journaling reads, and a heart is healed, made whole again, in the first real family she ever knew, one that is not imaginary. And today that family endures, and the house is noisy and crazy and cluttered, and it is fantastic, because the places at the table are never set, nor do they have to be. This family defines itself. This family is for keeps. So, one of the things I wanted to insist upon in the journaling is what family is like for my family, in contrast to the kind of the notion of family that I grew up in, where there are really specific roles that people play in a family, and there's just very little flexibility, and there's no real way out of that. Family doesn't have to be this regulated thing. It's love that binds it together, not routine. And so the title then just came to me at that point. It's No More Playing House. And so what I used there were October afternoon letters. from the daily flash lines. And they're really fun to use. I like the multicolors, and they are repositionable, so you can move them pretty easily without the paper tearing underneath. So what I did was I adhere them to the page and then ran a stitch across the title, both lines of it. And then I pulled up little bits of the letters here and there. And it was at that point, I'm sorry to say, that my video camera went a bit wonky for some reason. And then it was magic. Boom, the next frame showed a finished layout. So I'm sorry about that. But what I did add was actually very simple. It was a few wood veneer pieces from Lily B, and then stamps. The stamps I put next to each section, and they represent the family configurations that I've known through my life, starting with very traditional structures, and then now with the three of us, a really tightly knit family unit. The timeline approach in this layout turned out to be an invaluable tool for helping me to find clarity and to create unity on the page. It also prompted me to realize just how much I've grown over time and how blessed I am. Thanks for joining me for this week's Storytellers.